Hello everyone, my name is Yara and today I'm going to be doing a recent reads for basically all the books that I've read so far this year in 2023. So the first few months of this year, I was actually doing pretty good with my reading goal. Not really in terms of numbers, but in terms of like reading consistently and just always having a book. But the last month, honestly, has not been the greatest for me. I was waiting until June to kind of be more of like half of the year what I've read. But honestly, I don't think I read really anything in May and June. But that's beside the point. I do have 9 books to share with you today and give you my review for. So far the year has been, I don't want to say mid, but I haven't had any 5 stars. I think the highest I gave was 4.5, but the majority were 4 stars, so it wasn't like it was bad, but I feel like I haven't truly like loved a book in a long time. So hopefully that'll change in the second half of the year. So without further ado, let's just get started. The first book that I read actually started in 2022, but I ended up finishing it in January, and that is Babel by R.F. Kuang. Now, if you've been anywhere on the internet in the last few months, you know that this book is super popular. It has also generated a lot of controversy, but basically this is R.F. Kuang's first book outside of the Poppy War series, which was also an immensely popular historical fantasy series that I have not read, but I have been meaning to. And this is also historical fantasy, but it is much more dark academia. This is about a young boy named Robin Swift who, after his family dies of cholera in China, he is taken to England under the guardianship of an Oxford professor. He is basically bred from a young age to study translation, mainly Chinese and English, and ultimately ends up getting admitted into Oxford University and the Royal Institute of Translation, also known as Babel. So at first, Robin is really excited by this opportunity to study in this highly revered, probably the most revered translation institute in the world, and he develops a really close friendship with the other members of his cohort, Rami, who is from India, Victoire, who is from Haiti, and Letty, who is from England, as the daughter of some official person, I think. However, as he dives more into his studies at Oxford, he starts to realize that the reasons that he is here and the work that they're doing may have far more nefarious reasons than he was initially led on to believe. And this is heightened when he discovers an underground society set on taking down this powerful institution. So I did mention that this is a historical fantasy novel, and I do have to say that the fantasy element is pretty minor, though it is a significant part of the book. The fantasy element is really in what are these magic silver bars that are powered by what are called matched pairs. For some reason I have a hard time explaining it, but essentially you create a pair of words that are translated between languages, and the meaning that is lost when you translate them can elicit some sort of magical effect. And these silver bars are basically what drives the political and economic power of the British Empire in this alternative history, and basically allows them to be such an imperial force against other nations across the world. So as this is dark academia, the one thing that I was looking for in this book was its critique of academia as an institution, and that is where I think this book really delivers. It is how it gets you to think about language and how powerful language can be. I really enjoyed the way that this book dissected that and how it actually has power over cultures and how we perceive cultures and how we exert power over other cultures that are non-white usually. And so throughout this book, Robin, along with Rami and Victoire, who are also not originally from England, have to confront this fact that not only are they being exploited through their own labor and their own work in this institute, but that their labor is going to be used to exploit the people that they came from and the languages that they are learning and trying to dissect and learn more about. We see in various ways how even though they are the ones excited about language, excited about the history and the culture, how they are not in charge of what kinds of questions they can ask or what they can investigate. The Institute is really only interested in what can ultimately benefit the British Empire. And the other part of this novel that I really found interesting, especially as someone who is a child of immigrants and a child of the diaspora, is how language can function as both a tie and a barrier to your own culture. In order to create these silver bars, you have to be fluent in the language. Without spoiling too much, there is a character that we meet who was taken away from his land at a very young age, where he didn't get the chance to develop fluency in his native tongue, or by the time he grew up he forgot it. And so he doesn't have that ability that Robin and the others do because he doesn't have that connection. That's another example about how the magic system is used as a vehicle to convey the themes of this book, because that really hit close to home, especially as someone who is trying to learn their heritage language, that the older you get and the more distant and unable to go back and be truly immersed in your culture. There's a kind of isolation that comes with that because you aren't able to fully embrace or utilize something that is yours by heritage but you can't access. So yeah, this is just kind of the book that makes you want to talk about it and really think about how language functions in our current society and how it has in history. But I did have some criticisms. I did ultimately give this a 4-star. This book is pretty lecture-based and pretty long and slow for a lot of it. It's very much like immersed in that school setting and as if you are actually a student with them, which I didn't really mind too much because, I don't know, I just really enjoyed learning what they were learning, but that did slow the pace down. The other criticism that I see that I do kind of agree with this book is that some of the social commentary feels like it was, or definitely was, written in the lens of someone in the 21st century, which is not inherently a problem. It just felt like some of the language or conversations just felt like something that I've seen on Twitter or something very modern. Like, it didn't use these words exactly, but there's definitely things about affirmative action or white feminism that were definitely meant to be commenting on something that happens currently, as opposed to just existing in this time period, which I'm sure it did happen at the time period, but again, it just felt like the conversation was definitely geared towards something that was happening right now. And so it can kind of take you away from the story a little bit, but not a huge issue. You can get over it pretty fast. So yeah, I ultimately gave this 4 stars. I think it's definitely worth the read. This is a thick book. My hand hurts now. The next book that I read is When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. So basically, the last couple of years, I've tried to always start the year with some book having to do with medicine. I'm an incoming first-year medical student, and the past couple of years, I've been on this like pre-med journey. And with that, I wanted to make sure that I was learning more about the field and getting more of a perspective, especially with books written by doctors and getting their perspective on that profession. And I was really surprised that it took me this long to get to this book because it's like the first one that you see when you look up, oh, best books to read for pre-med students. But 3 years later, I finally got to it. This is a memoir written by the author, Paul Kalanithi, who was an American neurosurgeon who, during his training, discovered that he was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. And so he went from this position of helping save people's lives to being the patient himself and having to confront his own mortality. This is a really short book. I think the audiobook was only about 6 hours long, so even less if you were listening to it on like 2x speed. And so I finished it really quickly, and I think that was kind of a detriment for this particular book because I think it's the kind of book where you really want to sit with it and think about what he's saying and really process the emotions that he's going through. The book talks about his entire life and the things about what led him to medicine and why he chose this path and why he liked neurosurgery. What actually really stood out to me was the fact that in college he majored in English and got a master's in philosophy before he even decided to go to medical school. As someone who really enjoys the humanities but is going into a career in medicine, that was something that I really loved to see and felt really empowered by, to see how he utilized that mindset of really wanting to dissect the human experience and what makes us human, what makes life worth living, all these really existential questions, and how that really guided his philosophy as he went into his career as a surgeon. Like I said, I wish I read this a little bit slower just so that I could really get the impact of it more, but there were some quotes that I thought really stood out to me. One of them is, "Science may provide the most useful way to organize empirical, reproducible data, but its power to do so is predicated on its inability to grasp the most central aspects of human life: hope, fear, love, hate, beauty, envy, honor, weakness, striving, suffering, virtue." Another quote is, "The tricky part of illness is that, as you go through it, your values are constantly changing. You try to figure out what matters to you, and then you keep figuring it out. It felt like someone had taken away my credit card, and I was having to learn how to budget. You may decide you want to spend your time working as a neurosurgeon, but 2 months later, you may feel differently. 2 months after that, you may want to learn to play the saxophone or devote yourself to the church. Death may be a one-time event, but living with terminal illness is a process." I don't have too much to say beyond that, besides I agree with these lists and that I think that if you are interested in pursuing the medical field and becoming a doctor, this is definitely something that you should read and keep in mind. Personally, for me, reading these kinds of books really strengthens the reasons why I want to be a doctor and helps motivate me by really grounding me in what it means to care for someone's health and what that kind of care can look like. The next book that I read is As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow by Zulfa Kato. This book follows Salama, who is a first-year pharmacy student when the war in Syria breaks out. She is thrusted into this environment of danger and violence, but as a pharmacy student, she decides to volunteer in the hospitals and homes. After her older brother is captured and imprisoned after working on the rebel side, she is desperate to find a way to get her and her pregnant sister-in-law out of the country. While volunteering, she also ends up meeting a boy named Kinan, and they start forming a really close relationship as they kind of only have each other to lean on, as they just try to survive what is going on in the Syrian revolution. So this was one of my most highly anticipated books of last year, mainly because of the content. I'm Syrian, my family is from Syria, so this topic is something that hits really close to home. And so going into it, I knew this was going to be an emotional, really devastating ride, and that it was. The scenes where Salama is volunteering in the hospital, especially in the aftermath of different bombings or attacks, are really heartbreaking to witness. The stress of not having the supplies, of having to decide who gets supplies, not having enough personnel to even deal with the amount of injuries there are. Every time there was a scene like that, it just felt like a punch to the gut. Another thing that I think this book really developed well was the kind of guilt that a lot of these people in Syria and eventually refugees face in the choice of whether or not they are going to leave their home country. Especially in the case of Salama, who has the ability to help people. She has, albeit not completed, but she has some medical knowledge, has been apprenticing under a doctor, she's learned something, she knows how to help people. And every day more and more medical personnel are leaving Syria to find safety for themselves. But she knows that she will just be another one of those people that is contributing to not having enough staff to help all the people injured who cannot leave. And that guilt is only amplified after she meets Ganan, who is really dead set on doing what he can to stay on Syrian ground to help his people. It was just really powerful how it highlighted that the choice to leave your home country, even in the face of danger, is not an easy one. And how it humanizes the refugee experience and what exactly people go through to get to the point where they need to go through such dangerous and backdoor paths to get out and find somewhere safe to live. So all this to say is that I have no issue with themes of this book or the content and the overall message of what it is. All of my critiques are purely on the construction and some writing choices that were made. In particular, a part of this book has to do with Salama's PTSD, and it's in the form of a character named Khof. In some ways, I really did like the fact that this was included because it did talk about the ways that PTSD can manifest and the kinds of thoughts that it can have kind of intruding in your head. But I don't know, the way that they made Khof an actual character and how they made Salama literally say oh, this is a manifestation of my PTSD, almost very literally. It just felt like it was trying to over-explain what he was and provide a lot of logic, but it almost felt like the author was trying to hold your hand in this kind of metaphor, especially because if you know Arabic, Khof literally stands for fear. On the one hand, it was kind of a minor thing, but on the other hand, it was a decent part of the story where it did impact, and I feel like it almost lessened the effect of what she was trying to do with that character. However, I will say that there is a kind of plot twist. I don't really want to say plot twist because that almost seems kind of trivial in terms of the topical matter that this is talking about, but just something that you learn that completely reframes how you view the entire book, at least what you've read up to that point. And maybe other people caught on to it before I did, but for me it was a big surprise, and I thought it was really well done. And knowing how that plot point was handled kind of reinforced what I didn't like about the Khof character. It's really hard to talk about this without spoilers, but hopefully if you read it you can kind of see what I'm saying or disagree with me, let me know. And lastly, as you might have gathered from the synopsis and the introduction of a boy, there is a romance in this book. It is a halal romance, if that is something that you were looking for. And it really ends up just being this really sweet aspect of the book. You can really see how these characters get to know each other and understand each other on a deeper level and be the person that the other person needs in this moment in time. It does happen rather quickly, but given the stakes of what's going on, it was still pretty believable to me. So overall, I think I landed on a 4-star after initially finishing it, but I think it's probably closer to a 4.5 stars because the more I think about it, the more it's still impacting me. I definitely think it belongs in the ranks of other hard-hitting YA books. It feels really validating to see Syrian voices like this be uplifted and their stories be uplifted in the mainstream. The next book I have is The Hidden Palace by Helene Wecker. This is the sequel to The Golem and the Genie by the same author, which I read, I think 2 years ago now? No, I read it in 2020. I read it at the very beginning of COVID. Oh my god. The Golem and the Genie is basically about a golem and a genie who basically end up finding themselves in turn of the century New York and having to assimilate themselves as humans. The golem named Chava in the Jewish community in New York City, and the genie named Ahmed, who gets involved in the Syrian community. And I always find it really hard to try to explain this book because even though we are dealing with these mythological creatures, the story itself can be very mundane. It is very centered on the human-human interactions and how both Chava and Ahmed learn to develop community as well as struggle with developing community. Something in this book that they really have to deal with is the fact that they do not age, and so as they are living as a part of these communities who do not know who they really are or what they really are, they realize that they cannot stay in the same place forever. They have to be moving, have to reinvent themselves in order to avoid suspicion. And while in the first book, what really drew Chava and Ahmed together was the fact that they had this shared experience of being foreigners in a city of foreigners, in this novel they start to realize that maybe that's not enough and that maybe their differences are too much for them to really be able to be with each other. This book also expands our cast of characters and their perspectives. We have the daughter of a rabbi who becomes orphaned at the start of the novel. We have the son of one of the characters from the first book, one of Chava's friends, who is becoming a teenager and takes a job as a messenger boy. And we have an heiress that was also in the first novel who is now dealing with the aftermath of her interaction with Ahmed. And so that is something that I really enjoyed about this novel, is how we get so many characters and we really get into the heads of a lot of people and their experiences and how they all slowly build and start intertwining and connecting to each other. It's one of those stories that even though there's not a whole lot of plot going on or it is moving rather slowly, it feels worthwhile in the end because of those moments where you realize how everything is connected. Another thing that I think was really interesting about this book is the introduction of a female genie and then a male golem, kind of serving as foils to our main characters, Chava and Ahmed. And they sort of represent what their lives could have been like or who they could be if they had not adjusted to human society, had not assimilated, and I guess been more traditionally what their creatures were meant to be. And I think it was a really good way of how this book explored how Chava and Ahmed were dealing with these changes and figuring out what they want and how they want to live their life. And the last thing that I'll say that I just personally really liked about these books is the atmosphere and the setting. I really liked being in this early New York City setting. I like that a lot of historical events are referenced. This time period is kind of leading up to World War I. But you also have things like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which is not something that I really heard mentioned other than my middle school history textbook. And so yeah, that was just a part of like the historical fiction aspect of this that I really liked. There's a very cozy atmosphere, like really warm and next to a fireplace. I don't know if I would consider this cozy fantasy. I don't really know what cozy fantasy is, but I do get very cozy vibes from it. So ultimately I gave this 4 stars. It really is just an endearing story about humanity and connections and community at its core. Okay, I took a break to go eat and now it's dark outside. The next book I read is Chain of Thorns by Cassandra Clare. Now, this book is really huge, so we'll see how long I can hold it up. But I won't go too far into this. I am planning on making a whole video with spoilers. Plan is the operative term because I feel like I keep making promises that I don't keep. But anyway, this is the 3rd book in the, what is the series called again? The Last Hours trilogy, which is the sequel series to the Infernal Devices trilogy by Cassandra Clare, which is a spin-off of the Mortal Instruments. So in general, I would say I have a mixed relationship with Cassandra Clare books, but the first 2 installments of this series I really liked. There was a lot of things set up. There are so many characters, and that's kind of where the fault lies, in that there is so many characters that I think it was truly just impossible to really give each one their due story. And I think for a lot of them, it wasn't horrible. It just, because there were so many characters, you couldn't even like enjoy what was happening to one character, really get invested in it, because you had to keep jumping around. And so you almost forgot the last thing that happened to the character because you had to go through like 7 million other plot points before you get back to that storyline. And speaking of plot points, this book just went like completely lost the plot. Completely. Now, I don't really read Cassandra Clare books for the plot really, or the world building. Like, it's enough to get me interested and I'm kind of intrigued, but obviously I'm there for the romance, I'm there for the characters. So I guess I can't say that it didn't deliver in that sense, but the plot got so ridiculous and she just completely dropped the ball that it was noticeable. Like, I could not tell you really the main plot of the Infernal Devices series, like, but I knew it was there and there was some big bad and the big bad made sense. Here, I feel like she just forgot what she was writing, or she got overwhelmed with the characters. I mean, this is not a tiny book. It's longer than the previous two. And I still feel like it didn't really do the end justice. I feel like I'm really ratting on this book, but I think I gave it a 3.5 stars because I cannot say that I was not seated. But I'm pretty sure that Cassandra Clare has said that I think she's taking a break from the Shadowhunters books for a while because she's kind of been in a rut, and I feel like that was very noticeable with this book. And because my expectations were so high, and also the fact that this book release was delayed like so many times, that it was like 2 years since the last book, I just had high hopes, and it didn't really meet that. But it wasn't terrible. That's just how it goes, I guess. Now, switching up genres completely, we have Medical Apartheid by Harriet E. Washington. And I believe the full title is The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present. So, as I mentioned, I've been trying to read more medical books, and this one came more from a place of education. Not that the other one wasn't education, but that was more of like a personal anecdote and a personal narrative, whereas this one is more of a historical and sociological perspective. So Harriet E. Washington is a medical ethicist, and she really breaks down this idea of medical apartheid meaning an institution in which a certain group of people is treated as second-class citizens, and in this case, how the medical field has contributed and has propagated that apartheid. And also how advances in medicine have been because of the mistreatment of Black citizens in the US. There are a lot of things in this book that I maybe had heard of or had talked about briefly in school, for instance, like the Tuskegee syphilis study. But this book really goes into depth about what brought about these situations, what made them continue as they were, and what changes have been made since then, and what changes still need to be done. And even though I had some foundational knowledge, I was still consistently shocked and surprised in just how deeply racism was integrated into the history of medicine. Things like how slaves were used basically for doctors to practice on, and that's kind of how the field of gynecology was started. How a lot of hospitals were positioned in urban centers where more minority populations took place so that they could justify their experimentation on individuals due to the fact that it was for charity and that these individuals wouldn't have gotten medical care otherwise. How the prison system was also utilized in order to conduct studies on people without their consent or without informed consent. From a more writing perspective, I think this book was written very accessibly, even though it's written about a lot of scientific topics. It's not really about the core science. The author is writing more from a public health perspective, so it makes it very digestible and easy to understand. And besides near the end where we start getting into more law and policy parts of this whole narrative, where I start to get a little bit kind of unfamiliar with the wording and the terminology, for the most part, I was completely engaged the whole time. I said in the beginning how I didn't give anything 5 stars. I gave this 4.5 stars in my spreadsheet, but probably I'm going to round that up because it did what it meant to do. It was a very effective nonfiction novel. I'm not really going to judge it on entertainment because that's not really what it's for. So yeah, definitely highly recommend, especially if you are going into medicine. I know more medical school curriculums are including this kind of medical ethics and medical history into their curriculums, but it's not standardized. And I also think reading this before you enter medical school is useful to just get a scope of what the field of medicine was built on to understand kind of how to move forward in it. The next book I read is A Torch Against the Night by Sabaa Tahir. This is the second book in the An Ember in the Ashes series, or the Ember Saga. I read the first one, I think in 2020, so 3 years ago now. Sometimes you just don't realize how fast time is going. I do think it was a little bit of a detriment for me to have put so much space in between the first and second installment, because I will say I forgot a lot of it. I remember how I felt about the first one, and I tried to read some summaries, so I knew basically, but I feel like I wasn't as in it, especially in the beginning of the book. Obviously skip until I don't have the book up anymore if you have not read the first one, but basically this continues right after the end of the first novel, and Laia and Elias are fugitives and they're running away and trying to find a way to break into Kaf, the prison that's holding Laia's brother. In this book we also get a perspective from Helene, who was Elias's best friend in the first one. And that was something that I didn't realize I was going to enjoy as much when I first started. I have complicated feelings about Helene. I didn't realize until I saw the Goodreads reviews for this book that so many people like Helene. And I like her as a character, but she definitely gave white feminist vibes in the first one because she did not care about the scholars. It was only the fact that her people and her family are being affected now that she is standing up to the Commandant and I forgot whoever Marcus's position is called. But given all that, I do appreciate that we get her perspective and we see how she's not just a one-dimensional character, how we do actually empathize with her and sympathize for her, especially when we see what happens to her siblings. And you do also feel sympathetic because she doesn't know how to navigate this relationship with Elias. She obviously still loves him as a best friend, but she can't stray her loyalties. And Elias also had a really interesting arc in this book. I really like the place that we left off with him. Laia, I feel like, didn't have a lot in this book, to be fair. I feel like I wasn't fully invested, so maybe I forgot a lot of details or just wasn't as into it. But I don't know, her story didn't stand out to me besides any big reveals that happened when we were in her perspective. Immediately upon finishing the book, I knew that it just didn't hit me the same way that the first book did. The first book I was constantly engaged, I constantly wanted to turn the page. And I would say at about maybe halfway, I finally got to that point with this book. So the first half kind of struggles with that second book syndrome where we're kind of meandering. But I do think we finished the book at a really interesting place and I'm definitely going to continue. This is a side rant, but a lot of times it's hard to read fantasy series if you don't read them all in one go where you're really invested because you forget the lore. And then I try to look up the lore on the wiki, but I'm always at the risk of spoiling myself. And I don't know what lore is the lore that I just forgot or the lore that I just haven't learned yet and that I'm actually going to learn later on in the series. So that's kind of been my struggle with this series, but we're going to continue. And yeah, so with all that, I ended up giving this 3.5 stars. The last book I have is Misfit in Love by S.K. Ali. This is the sequel to Saints and Misfits, which is actually the first book I ever reviewed on my channel. So in Saints and Misfits, the main storyline that we are following is that the main character Jenna has been sexually assaulted by a kind of revered member of her mosque, and it's her journey of trying to deal with that and get the courage to speak up and also learn how to process it and ask for help. This book takes place a few years after Jenna is about to go to college, and it basically takes place over this time period where they're planning her brother's wedding. And as you can probably infer from the title, Jenna is ready to finally pursue things with a crush that she has developed that we saw in the first book, only to find that he is kind of treating her differently and she is trying to gain the courage to actually say how she feels. My thing with this book is that I can see in a lot of ways what it was trying to do, and I think it landed in some ways, but I think it ultimately kind of fumbled. It didn't really land. In both the first book and the second book, I really do enjoy how many times Jenna missteps or is going through this journey of self-discovery as well as gaining confidence. That's very emblematic of a teenager trying to experience love for the first time. But I think some of the narrative choices kind of hindered us from really being able to dive deep into any sort of emotional development. So I'm mainly referring to the fact that there is a love square in this book. That really threw me off because when this sequel was first announced a couple years ago, I really thought the only person was going to be that guy from the first book who I really liked. But no, soon we meet this one guy named Hatham, and then we meet another mysterious guy named Laith, and suddenly we're in a love triangle. No, a love square, sorry. And this is kind of an unpopular opinion, but I actually don't hate love triangles as a trope. I feel like if done very carefully and well done, one, they can make you very invested in the plot, but two, especially if the main character is interested in the guys for different reasons, I think it can be a good vehicle for self-discovery, which I was hoping would be the avenue this book would take, and kind of it does, but I don't know. I'm not gonna lie, one point in this love square did not need to be there. Frankly, served no purpose to her. Don't even know why I was there. The other guy I did like as an option, but I feel like he was introduced so late in the narrative that we didn't really get a chance to fully develop that. And I wish we did, because I found their story to be so much more interesting. Something that I did like that SKLE brought up is basically a subplot about anti-blackness within the South Asian and Arab communities, specifically because one of Jenna's love interests is black. And this, along with Saints and Misfits and SKLE's other books, I really appreciate her stories because she really tries to include these issues that a lot of people in the Muslim community do not want to talk about and do not often get represented in Muslim character narratives very often, because we are so focused on providing Muslim representation in a positive light and kind of countering this stereotypical narrative that is seen about Muslims in the US. And so I'm glad that she doesn't shy away from these kind of topics that we need to talk about as a community. Do I think it was handled perfectly? I guess not. I do think there was a lot more room for nuance or even just a deeper explanation and interrogation of it. At the same time, there were a lot of things going on in the narrative, so I feel like it did take a decent amount of space. So overall, it was a quick read, and there were a lot of endearing moments with friends and families. There's some cameos from her other books, like Love from A to Z, which were really fun to see because I really like those characters. There's a lot of drama, but also a lot of humor in all of the wedding event and planning festivities. I definitely recommend the first book, Saints and Misfits, and if you read that and liked it, I don't think you will hate this book, but I do think it could have been a little better. So overall, I gave it 3 stars. So I kind of lied in the beginning. I actually only read 8 books. I think I was counting the book that I had already started, but I haven't finished as the 9th one. But anyway, yeah, that was all the books that I have read so far this year. Kind of crazy that the one that I rated highest was the nonfiction one. Like, who am I? Please let me know if you read any of these books and what your thoughts are, as usual, in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.